Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a relationship that's been in the news a lot, the one between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
It's one of those things that you see pop up all the time but might not know that much about.
Yeah, exactly. And to really get into it, we're using Bruce Riedel's book, Kings and Presidents.
That's a great book for this topic. It really lays out the whole history of the relationship.
From FDR all the way up to today, right?
Yep.
Now, you might think oil and politics, kind of dry.
A little bit, maybe.
But trust me, this is juicy. Think like a historical drama full of clashing personalities, big egos, and some pretty surprising twists and turns.
It's one of those things that the more you learn about it, the more you realize how complicated and frankly strange it is. Like, this alliance wasn't built on shared values.
Right, not at all.
It was more about common enemies, a kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation.
Which, as we'll see, makes things really interesting.
Definitely. Creates a constant push and pull between practical politics and clashing ideologies. So, to really kick things off, Riedel takes us back to 1945. World War II is ending.
A huge moment in history, obviously.
And FDR, he's looking to secure oil for a rising America, meets with King Ibn Saud.
This is the first king of Saudi Arabia, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And get this, they meet on a U.S. warship.
In the Suez Canal, no less.
The USS Quincy. I mean, come on, it's a scene straight out of a movie, right?
It really is. You can practically picture it, can't you?
Totally. So what made this meeting so significant? I mean, we're talking about this meeting almost 80 years later. Why?
Well, this meeting on the USS Quincy, it really laid the groundwork for everything that came after. It established this foundation for the alliance, and it was built on two main things.
Oil and security, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Security for Saudi Arabia, oil for the United States. That's how it all started. It was a very specific need at a critical time.
And Riedel makes it clear this was not a partnership based on shared values. Like, he straight up says that Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy.
Limited religious freedom.
No room for dissent against the king.
Right. Very different from the ideals of the United States.
Very different. And yet they find themselves in this alliance. It makes you wonder how that even worked.
Well, it worked because they needed each other. The U.S. needed that oil, and Saudi Arabia needed protection. But it also created this constant tension, this dilemma for U.S. presidents.
Because how do you support an ally, especially during the Cold War?
Yeah, where you absolutely need them on your side against the Soviet Union.
But at the same time, how do you reconcile that with American values? It's a problem that, honestly, is still with us today.
100%.
So to really understand all the dynamics of this relationship, we have to understand Saudi Arabia itself, right? I mean, it's a very different type of country. And Riedel dives into the origins of the nation, how the House of Saud,
A ruling family.
joined forces with this pretty radical cleric named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab,
The founder of Wahhabism.
which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a super strict, ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam.
Yeah. We're talking about an emphasis on purifying the faith, getting rid of anything considered idolatrous.
Like, even calling for the expansion of Islam through jihad. And this isn't just ancient history. Like, this is the bedrock of Saudi Arabia today.
Right, it shapes everything. The internal politics, the social norms, foreign policy. It's all there.
And as an example, Riedel points to this event, the destruction of the Baqi Cemetery in Medina.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a powerful one.
So this place held the tombs of some really important figures from early Islam. It was revered by Shia Muslims, but the Saudis, they saw these tombs as idolatry.
And Wahhabism really frowns on any kind of idol worship.
And they destroyed them, which obviously caused massive tension with Shia communities, tension that still exists today. So it really shows you how this very specific internal religious doctrine can have huge geopolitical consequences.
Absolutely. Like what happens in Saudi Arabia doesn't stay in Saudi Arabia. It ripples out and affects the whole region, even the whole world.
Right. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll look at how these internal dynamics play out on the world stage and how the U.S. gets caught in the middle of it all. Don't go anywhere.
It really does. And it makes you think about the ripple effects of decisions made decades ago. It's like throwing a stone in a pond, the waves just keep going.
Exactly. And speaking of waves, the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has had its share of ups and downs, moments of cooperation, moments of tension.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a roller coaster.
And Riedel highlights some of the major turning points, these moments that really shifted the dynamic.
Like when Truman recognizes Israel in 1948.
Yeah, huge moment. And Saudi Arabia was furious.
Understandably so. From their perspective, it really complicated their position in the region.
And then you have the rise of Arab nationalism.
Figures like Nasser in Egypt, challenging the old order, pushing back against Western influence.
And Saudi Arabia is trying to maintain its leadership in this new landscape, trying to balance its ties to the U.S. with its role in the Arab world.
It was a tough spot to be in, for sure.
Yeah.
They needed the U.S., especially during the Cold War, as a counterweight to the Soviet Union.
But they also had to navigate this rising tide of Arab nationalism, this sense that the old ways were changing.
And that the U.S. wasn't always on the same page.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like during the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars, Riedel talks about how Saudi Arabia used what he calls the oil weapon.
The oil embargo. A pretty bold move.
It was basically using their control of oil to pressure the U.S. into a more pro-Arab position. But wasn't that risky? I mean, could that not have backfired and ruined the relationship?
It was definitely a gamble. It showed how much leverage Saudi Arabia had, how vital their oil was to the global economy. But it also exposed this underlying tension, this reality that their interests weren't always aligned.
So it's like a high wire act, this balancing act between cooperation and competition, between needing each other and being wary of each other.
Exactly. And then, in 1975, you had the assassination of King Faisal.
Which is still shrouded in mystery, right?
Well, not as much as people think. It sparked all these conspiracy theories, some even pointing fingers at the CIA.
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
But the truth, while still dramatic, is less about shadowy plots and more about family feuds.
So what actually happened?
King Faisal was killed by his nephew, a prince, who was seeking revenge for his brother's death. Apparently, his brother was killed during protests against the introduction of television in Saudi Arabia.
Wow. So even within the royal family itself, there was this tension, this clash between the old ways and the new.
Definitely. And this assassination, regardless of who was behind it, had a huge impact on the region. It created uncertainty, fear, and it showed that even seemingly powerful figures were vulnerable.
And after Faisal, you have Kings Khalid and Fahd taking over, each facing their own challenges. Riedel mentions this one event, the 1979 seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, and that's Islam's holiest site, right?
Yes, the most sacred place in the Muslim world.
And it was taken over by a group of armed extremists.
Yeah, it was a shocking event, one that really shook the Saudi leadership. It exposed vulnerabilities they didn't even realize they had.
And Riedel says there's still a lot we don't know about what happened behind the scenes, like how they eventually regained control of the mosque. It sounds like a story ripe for a movie or a documentary.
It definitely is. There's this element of secrecy, this sense that the Saudi government was trying to control the narrative, to downplay the extent of the challenge they faced.
So this event, it wasn't just about a mosque being seized. It was a sign of things to come, a sign that Islamic extremism was on the rise, and that even the Saudi government, the guardians of Islam's holiest sites, weren't immune.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call.
And then you have the Iran-Iraq war, this brutal conflict that lasted for 8 years.
And Saudi Arabia is caught in the middle, worried about the ambitions of both Iran and Iraq.
Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. It's like you can't win.
It was a really difficult position for them. They were trying to support Iraq against Iran, but they were also wary of Saddam Hussein's ambitions.
And then on top of all that, Riedel brings up this interesting contrast with King Fahd. He was known for his lavish lifestyle, even being called the Playboy King in his younger days.
Yeah, quite a contrast to the image of a pious religious leader.
So how did he reconcile those two sides?
Well, he eventually adopted a more conservative image, tried to present himself as a devout Muslim. It's like he was trying to balance these different aspects of his life, the personal and the political.
And that seems to be a recurring theme, this balancing act that Saudi leaders have to perform, trying to maintain their grip on power, navigate regional conflicts, and present a certain image to the world.
It's a high-wire act, for sure, and one that often involves making compromises, cutting deals, and playing the long game.
And speaking of cutting deals, there's this one that really surprised me. In the early 80s, King Fahd puts forward this 8-point peace plan for the Middle East.
I think a lot of people forget about that. It was actually quite a bold move at the time.
It was. He was trying to take a more active role in resolving the Palestinian issue. So what were the key points of this plan, and why didn't it work out?
Well, the Fahd plan, it was basically a roadmap for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It called for a complete Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in 1967, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, and the right of all states in the region to live in peace. On paper, it sounded good, but Israel rejected it outright.
So even with this attempt at peacemaking, the plan went nowhere. What does that tell us about U.S.-Saudi relations at the time, especially on the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
It shows that even though they were allies, their views on this particular conflict didn't always align. The U.S. was trying to balance its support for Israel with its relationship with Saudi Arabia, and it was a difficult line to walk. The FOD plan highlighted that difference in priorities, a difference that would continue to cause friction.
It seems like no matter how much they tried to find common ground, there were always these fundamental differences, these different perspectives that kept getting in the way.
Exactly. And those differences would only become more pronounced as new challenges emerged.
And one of those challenges came in the form of a secret purchase that totally blindsided the U.S. We're talking about Saudi Arabia buying ballistic missiles from China,
Ah, yes, that caused quite a stir in Washington.
to put it mildly. Prince Bandar, who was involved in the deal, was quoted as saying, "We bought them because they are on sale." I mean, that's quite a statement. What was the thinking behind this clandestine purchase?
Well, remember, the Iran-Iraq war was still going on, and the Saudis felt vulnerable. They didn't believe the U.S. was providing the security guarantees they needed, so they decided to take matters into their own hands. It was a way of saying, we can't always rely on you, so we'll look after our own interests.
So it was a calculated risk, a way of asserting their independence, even if it meant upsetting their most powerful ally. It's amazing how they managed to keep this deal under wraps for so long.
The Saudis are very good at keeping secrets, especially when it comes to their security. They have a long history of playing their cards close to their chest, and this purchase was a prime example of that.
It's a reminder that despite being allies, there are limits to how far they're willing to trust the U.S. with their security. They're not afraid to go their own way, even if it means making enemies in Washington.
Exactly. They have their own agenda, their own priorities, and they're not afraid to pursue them, even if it means ruffling some feathers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely sent a message. And then a few years later, Saddam invades Kuwait.
1990, another huge turning point. Suddenly, those U.S. troops that the Saudis were so wary of, they become essential.
Quite a turnaround.
So, I mean, what was that like for them, having to rely on the very power they'd tried to distance themselves from?
It must have been a very difficult pill to swallow. On one hand, you have Saddam, a real threat, right on their doorstep. On the other, you have to invite in the U.S. military, this massive force, onto your soil.
And this is a land considered sacred in Islam, right?
Absolutely. So for King Fahd to allow that, it was a huge decision. It really solidified the security partnership, but it also, stirred up a lot of resentment.
Which, as we know, Osama bin Laden was able to exploit. He used that resentment, that sense of violation, to fuel his message. But would bin Laden have risen to prominence without the Gulf War? I mean, was it that pivotal?
It definitely played a role, gave him this powerful symbol to rally against. But bin Laden's ideology was already there, simmering beneath the surface.
Yeah.
He opposed the Saudi royal family, saw them as corrupt, too close to the West.
And the presence of U.S. troops, especially near Islam's holiest sites, that just poured fuel on the fire.
Exactly. It gave him ammunition, this visual representation of what he saw as Western encroachment.
So you have these unintended consequences playing out. The war achieves its goal, Kuwait is liberated, but it also creates this new set of problems.
Which seems to happen a lot in this region, unfortunately. Decisions made with the best of intentions can have these ripple effects that no one anticipates.
Absolutely. And as we move into the Clinton years, Riedel focuses on two moments in particular. The 1996 Khobar Towers bombing, a devastating terrorist attack.
Yeah, 19 U.S. airmen were killed. A real tragedy.
And then this other incident where the U.S. and Saudi Arabia worked together to prevent Iran from getting their hands on some Boeing jets.
Kind of a strange mix. Cooperation on one hand, tension on the other.
Yeah, it's like they're constantly trying to figure out if they're on the same side or not.
Well, that's the nature of this relationship. It's never straightforward.
So the Khobar Towers bombing, I mean, you would think that something like that, a shared tragedy, would bring allies closer. But it seems like it had the opposite effect.
In a way, it did. There was this growing sense of suspicion on the Saudi side, particularly from Prince Nayef, the interior minister. He was convinced the U.S. was meddling in their affairs, and that made it really hard to cooperate fully on the investigation.
So even as they're facing a common enemy in terrorism, there's this underlying mistrust. It's almost like they're looking over their shoulders at each other.
Exactly. And then you have this whole episode with the Boeing jets. It shows that they could still work together when their interests aligned, but even then, it was this very strategic, almost competitive kind of cooperation,
Like they're playing a game of chess, trying to outmaneuver each other, even as they're on the same team.
which I guess is a pretty good metaphor for the whole relationship, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, so we're at the end of the Clinton years. The relationship is strained, but still functional. But then George W. Bush comes in, and as we've already talked about, he has a very different approach. Riedel mentions that things get off to a rocky start, even leading to a near oil crisis. What was that all about?
Well, Bush, unlike Clinton, wasn't as focused on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. His priorities were different, and his administration really clashed with the Saudis over oil production.
Because the Saudis were resisting increasing output, right? And that led to worries about higher oil prices.
Exactly. There was this feeling that the Saudis were putting their own interests ahead of the global economy. And it created this real tension, this early sense that the Bush administration and the Saudis weren't on the same page.
And then, of course, 9/11 happens and everything changes. It's hard to even imagine the world before that day. For the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, it was a turning point, but not in a good way.
It really was. You have 15 of the 19 hijackers, being Saudi citizens, this longtime ally, suddenly in the spotlight accused of harboring terrorists. It was a nightmare scenario for both countries.
And the accusations were flying. People were demanding answers. There was this immense pressure on the Saudis to prove their commitment to fighting terrorism, to distance themselves from al-Qaeda. How did they handle that?
It was a really delicate situation. Prince Bandar, who was the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. at the time, he played a crucial role. He was very close to the Bush family, and he worked tirelessly to reassure the U.S. that Saudi Arabia was on their side.
So he was kind of like a bridge between the two countries, trying to smooth things over.
Exactly. But even with his efforts, the damage was done. Suspicions lingered, and the image of Saudi Arabia, especially in the eyes of many Americans, was tarnished.
It's interesting how this one event, this horrific tragedy, could have such a profound impact on a relationship that had lasted for decades. It really shows you the fragility of even the strongest alliances.
It does. And as we move into the Bush administration's war on terror, we see this familiar tension reemerging. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia are cooperating on counterterrorism, sharing intelligence, cracking down on al-Qaeda. But at the same time, there are these growing concerns about the role of Wahhabism in inspiring extremism.
It's like a catch-22. They need Saudi Arabia's help to fight terrorism, but they also worry that Saudi Arabia's own ideology might be part of the problem.
Exactly. It's a very complicated situation, and one that highlights the challenges of trying to separate strategic interests from moral concerns.
And then we come to the Obama years. He takes a different approach, tries to engage with the Muslim world, talks about a new beginning. But how did that play out with Saudi Arabia?
It was a mixed bag. Some in Saudi Arabia welcomed Obama's outreach, his willingness to acknowledge past mistakes, to try to build bridges. But there were also those who were deeply suspicious of his motives, who saw his policies as a threat to their interests.
Like the nuclear deal with Iran.
That was a big one. The Saudis saw it as a betrayal, a sign that the U.S. was prioritizing its relationship with Iran over its relationship with them. And then you have Obama's reluctance to get more deeply involved in the Syrian civil war. The Saudis were eager to see Assad toppled, and they felt like Obama wasn't doing enough to help.
So you have this sense of disappointment, this feeling that the U.S. is no longer the reliable ally it once was. And then on top of all that, you have the Arab Spring.
Which really threw the Saudis for a loop. They saw these uprisings, these demands for democracy, as a direct threat to their own rule.
They were terrified of the domino effect, right? That if one Arab monarchy fell, others would follow.
Exactly. And that fear led them to take some pretty drastic measures, like sending troops into Bahrain to help crush the protests there.
Which, of course, clashed with the U.S.'s stated support for democracy and human rights. So you have this growing gap between the two countries, the sense that they're no longer on the same page.
And that gap only widens as the region descends further into chaos. You have the Syrian civil war raging, ISIS emerges, and the Saudis launch their intervention in Yemen. It's a period of immense instability, and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are struggling to find common ground.
And then in a complete reversal, you have Trump coming into office and essentially giving the Saudis a blank check. He downplays human rights concerns, praises MBS, and makes Saudi Arabia his first foreign trip as president. It's a dramatic shift.
It was, and it really highlights the transactional nature of Trump's approach to foreign policy. He saw Saudi Arabia as a key partner in his efforts to contain Iran, and he was willing to overlook their flaws, their human rights abuses, in pursuit of that goal.
And then, of course, you have the Khashoggi murder, which even Trump couldn't completely ignore. It strained the relationship, even with Trump's attempts to shield MBS from blame.
It did. And it showed the limits of even the most transactional of relationships. The Khashoggi murder was so brutal, so brazen, that it became impossible to sweep under the rug. It forced the U.S. to confront the moral implications of its close ties to the Saudi regime.
And then Biden comes in and he signals a return to a more values-based approach. He criticizes Saudi Arabia's human rights record, their war in Yemen, but at the same time, he recognizes their strategic importance. It's a tough balancing act.
It is. And I think that's where we are today, trying to figure out how to navigate this complex relationship, how to balance our interests with our values. The world has changed a lot since that meeting on the USS Quincy back in 1945. The old assumptions, the old certainties, they're gone.
And we're left with this question: can this alliance, built more on shared enemies than shared values, survive in a world where the U.S. is no longer the dominant power it once was, and where Saudi Arabia itself is facing growing internal pressures for change?
It's a big question, one with no easy answers. But it's a question we have to grapple with. The U.S.-Saudi relationship has shaped the Middle East for decades, for better or worse, and it's likely to continue to do so for many years to come.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway is this. We need to be informed, engaged citizens. We need to understand the complexities of this relationship, the history, the challenges, the opportunities, because ultimately the choices we make, the policies we support, they have real-world consequences, they affect people's lives, they shape the course of history.
Absolutely. This isn't just an academic exercise. It's about the world we live in, the world we're shaping for future generations. And we all have a role to play in that.
So, to everyone listening, keep asking questions, keep learning, keep engaging. The more we understand about the world, the better equipped we'll be to make a positive difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.